Hey everyone. Thanks for tuning in. It's time for the C3 Stream.
Hey, Christ Church, Pastor Bob here. I am sitting in for Pastor Andrew for our See Through the Scripture teaching tonight. You probably know from last week, Pastor Andrew is a little under the weather, so he's just not able to sit in the chair, so you get me today. So I'm really excited about being here and thrilled about being able to walk in the Word with you. It is one of my favorite things I love. Just being able to walk with people through the Word, and that's what we're doing in this experience on these Tuesday night studies is to walk through an effort called See Through the Scriptures. It's just a quick walk. It's more like a jog. It's more like a sprint. Sprinting through to get an overall view of kind of God's revelation in the Word and how He's worked among His people over the ages. And so we're going to do that tonight. We're going to kind of pick up what Pastor Andrew left off, and that's with the people just ready to go into the land. And then we're going to walk through, really just walk through two books tonight. We're going to walk through the book of Joshua, and we're going to walk through the book of Judges. So we got a pretty fast pace. But hopefully you'll walk pretty fast with me tonight. To do that, you can listen. I'm going to just be talking. You should know that this is pre-recorded, though. And so for this experience, not going to have the ability to be able to have you chat in. So if you've got questions or things you wonder about, what you hear tonight, just go ahead and email. Just email me, email Pastor Andrew, and we'll try to answer those questions that way. But just given the format, just didn't have the opportunity to be able to do it live. So, but we will get the word to you and be available to answer those questions in other ways. So as we go through it tonight, it's great material, but want to encourage you, if you can, to not only listen, but grab a Bible, right? Nothing like working in the book itself. And so if you can, grab a Bible or grab an app. I've got your Bible app on it, whatever works for you. I am going to refer to some verses tonight. They're just some great verses that you don't want to miss because they really speak not only to history in terms of the history of God's people, but they speak to our history as well. So I'm going to try to highlight those as we walk through Scripture together today. So let's get to it. You should be seeing on your screen kind of our first picture here. And this is a picture that tries to capture the conquest of the land and to give some summary to the book of Joshua. And you've got Joshua up on the top corner there blowing the ram's horn. And really the challenge of the book of Joshua right away is the challenge of the transfer of leadership. And up until now, for the people of God, Moses has been the leader, right? Moses was the leader who confronted Pharaoh, and he's the leader that took them through the Red Sea, and he's the leader that brought them through the wilderness. But now, as they're ready to go in and take the land, Moses' leadership is coming to an end. And now there's a transfer of authority from Moses to Joshua. And Joshua has been number 2 in command. He's been kind of the helpmate for Moses. But now he gets to step into Moses' shoes. And boy, put yourself in that spot. Think about the implications of that, right? That you're now the guy who is supposed to step into those shoes of Moses. I got to imagine that would be a pretty intimidating kind of experience. And not one that, boy, you would just leap at necessarily. It's got to be a call on your life. And yet that's the call that is issued to Joshua. And we get that call right away in the first chapter of the book of Joshua. And I don't want you to miss this because, and I think there's lots of times in our life where God is laying something out in front of us, and it's pretty intimidating. We really wonder, how in the world can we do that? It's pretty difficult for us to imagine how that can be accomplished, right? And yet, the call is on our life. We feel that nudge of God, and we know in faithfulness we just need to step into it, but not an easy task. That's exactly what is going on in this experience now of this transfer of authority from Moses to Joshua. And the call on Joshua is to not only take over leadership, but to go in and take over the promised land. Now that in and of itself is intimidating. It's like a double whammy for this guy, right? Because not only is he being challenged to take over for Moses and step into those shoes, but now he's being challenged to be the leader who militarily goes in and conquers the land. Now keep in mind that his people, the people of God here, the people of Israel here, what had they done before this? Well, they were in Egypt as slaves. They made bricks. They didn't go through, the Egypt's version of West Point, right? They didn't go through any kind of military academy, right? And then when they left Egypt, they wandered in the wilderness. And they fought battles, learned how to fight, but again, they had no kind of training on how to be this army of conquest. And so Joshua's taking over leadership for Moses, but he also is taking over the responsibility to enter that land and mount a campaign, a military campaign, to conquer the people who are there. Hopefully you can see how intimidating and how difficult that would be, right? The thought of not only taking over for Moses, but on top of that, to be a military leader when you've had no training, no opportunity other than the battles you've had in the wilderness and coming up to this point. And that's what's in front of Joshua. Not an example. How in the world can this happen? How in the world can I take over for Moses and fill those shoes? How in the world can we go in there and take over the land? Everything seems stacked against them. Everything just seems impossible. Yet look at chapter 1. These are just like great words that you and I just need to hold on to, especially when we have the same kind of moments that come up in our lives. Look at chapter 1. And you go down to verse 6, right? And you get this fantastic word where it says, "Be strong and courageous, for you are the one who will lead these people to possess all the land I swore to their ancestors I would give them. Be strong and very courageous." So God's laying it out for Joshua, saying, Joshua, listen, step into it, man. Be strong, be courageous, don't be afraid. Just step into those shoes of Moses. Don't be afraid. Step into the opportunity of taking the land, right? Be strong and be courageous, right? And now he gives them a warning. He gives them a word and says, here's how it's going to work. You can be strong and courageous, right? But you got to be careful to obey all the instructions Moses gave you. Don't deviate from them, turning either to the right or to the left. Then you'll be successful in everything you do. And so we have emerging right away in the book of Joshua is the challenge and the tension that's going to continue through the whole book and onward. And that is the challenge of simply being faithful. Trusting God, being strong, being courageous, stepping forward faithfully, trusting that God is the one who is going to deliver the victory. And that's the tension. Just trusting that God's got it, trusting that God goes before us, trusting that all we have to do is concentrate on a relationship with God, and that God will fight the battles, God will deliver the future, God will create the opportunities in our lives. And that's the challenge given to Joshua and the challenge to God's people here. Verse 9 says, "This is my command, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged." Why? "For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." And that sets the tone for the book. And I think it sets the tone for the call in our lives too, right? To enter into this book, to walk with Joshua and God's people, but to understand that our story is part of their story, right? Their story is part of our story, right? The same challenge to be strong and be courageous because we have a faithful God. We have a God who goes before us. He creates opportunity, but he just calls us to be faithful, to seek him first, to be faithful to him first, to just follow wherever he leads. And even though it won't always add up, right? Even though it's going to be difficult for us to process and try to make sense out of it, right? Imagine, and we're gonna see this when we get to a little further in the book of Joshua, chapter 6, where they defeat Jericho, right? And think about think about that one, where God said, "Listen, you're gonna defeat the most fortified city in the entire region, and here's how you're gonna do it. You're just gonna walk around the city 6 days in a row. You're just gonna march around, and the seventh day you're gonna march around, but that day you're gonna blow the horn and you're gonna shout, and the city is gonna be yours because the walls are gonna crumble." Right. I mean, really, that's the plan. That's it, right? Yeah, that's it. Because the plan isn't centered in the ability of God's people to be mighty warriors. The plan is centered in their faithfulness to the one who is their mighty warrior. That God goes before them. He will deliver them. He will defeat their enemies. He will be the one who makes their future possible. He will lead them into the future and into now the promised land. And that's right away in chapter 1, why he gives that challenge of being strong and courageous because I am with you. And that's immediately followed by Joshua confronting the commander of the Lord's armies. And that's all it is. It's a conversation between Joshua and the commander of the Lord's armies. There's not a big outcome to it other than this reassurance that God is going to go in front of them, that he is going to go before them, and he is going to take them into the land, and all they have to do is be faithful and just trust him. And that happens right away, and we see the hint of that right away in chapter 2. In chapter 2, they do what military guys would do. They send out spies to spy out Jericho, this fortified city. And of course, the people of Jericho are nervous. They know what's going on, that God's people are there, ready to come into the land. And so they're sensitive. They're looking for spies. And the net result is you get introduced to this woman named Rahab. Rahab is a prostitute who hides the spies up on her roof. And in return, the spies promise that Rahab and her whole family will be preserved. Now what's interesting is not just the story, cool story that it is, but what's interesting is to hear what Rahab says to the spies. And this shows you how God is already, before they've even spied out the land, how God is already in front of them, that he's already making that future conquest possible. If you look at chapter 2 and you go over to verse 10, you have Rahab talking with the spies. And Rahab says, "For we have heard how the Lord made a dry path for you through the Red Sea when you left Egypt, and we know what you did to the kings," right, and the Amorite kings east of the Jordan, how you completely destroyed them. And no wonder our hearts have melted in fear. No one has the courage to fight after hearing such things, for the Lord your God is the supreme God of the heavens above and the earth below. And that is just a great witness to how God is already working, right? The spies discover that God has already set fear in the hearts of those people. Well, how did that happen? When did that happen? Well, that happened way back in Egypt. That happened way back when God rescued his people from slavery in Egypt. That God story was so profound and so impactful that the people of Jericho remember. And this is a big deal. This is really important. It's important for us too, because it shows us the power of telling God stories. And that's what we do at Christ Church, right? We tell God stories all the time. Why? Because God uses those stories. God uses those stories to witness to himself. God uses those stories to display himself. God uses those stories to make inroads and prepare the way forward for us. It's exactly what happened here. They reflect, they know the story of how God conquered Pharaoh, who would have been the most powerful king of his time, how God conquered and swallowed up Pharaoh in the Red Sea and brought his people through on dry land. And so out of Rahab's mouth, we get the affirmation of the promise that we heard from God already in chapter 1. God is already working. God is already out in front of them. God is already preparing the way. And he started preparing that way back when he rescued his people from slavery and conquered Pharaoh in Egypt. It is just, you think about how far-reaching is God's future, how far-reaching is God's understanding of preparation for his people. I don't know about you, but boy, that gives me hope, that gives me comfort to know that God hasn't changed, and that as God was doing it then, he's doing it now, right? And so our future is his, and he's preparing it. And the call in our lives, just like Joshua, be strong, be courageous. Why? Because the Lord our God is with us. And so we can step out and step into that future, not because of ourselves, but because we know God is with us. Good word? Great way to start, isn't it? You bet. Well, we get then in chapter 3, we get the Israelites crossing the Jordan. Just a great witness, a great story. It says they're there at the Jordan. It's harvest time. The banks are flooded, and yet when the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant, and that goes first, right? No warriors first. The Ark of the Covenant goes first. You know, and you look at your diagram, and you see the Ark of the Covenant there at the very center, right? And there's a sword behind it, that the Ark of the Covenant is the strength, is the power, is the witness to the power of God going before them. And so the Ark of the Covenant, carried by the priest, goes to the flooded banks of the Jordan River. And it's so cool. It says, as soon as the soles of their feet, the toes of the priests, touch the water of the Jordan River rolls back, and they're able to walk through on dry ground. And so we get here another Exodus, right? This is just like the experience back in Egypt when God rescued them from slavery. Is like bookends, right? Now as they go into the promised land, we get another Exodus, an Exodus out of wilderness, an Exodus out of wandering into the land that God has long promised. And so the water rolls back, and the people of God walk through on dry ground, just as they did at the Red Sea. And kind of one interesting little sub-point in this experience is it says that God stopped the river flowing, right? He rolls back the water, the headwaters, he stops the water flowing, but the water downstream continues to flow away. And so it says the whole river dries up. What's important about that? Well, think about it. What if you're the guy 2 miles downstream, right? You're the guy that lives 2 miles downstream, and you rely on that water for your crops and for your water for drinking and everything, bathing. I mean, that's your source of water. And all of a sudden, the stream dries up. Well, you investigate. What's going on here, right? And so what happens? The dry stream becomes the opportunity for people to hear the story and find out what God is doing. That God is creating the opportunity for witness as the people cross into the promised land. And you're going to see that as you go through Joshua, the rest of the book, even into Judges, you're going to see how this story, this God story now, gets told and creates the opportunity for God's people to conquer their enemies. And so the story about the Red Sea, and now the story about the Jordan River drying up and God's people walking in becomes part of what God uses to create fear and defeat in the enemies of God's people. And so they walk through. Then you get this unique experience of as they cross, Joshua tells them to start collecting stones, right? It's not that he's a geologist, not that he's worried about having some souvenirs, but he tells them to go in, collect 10 stones, and stack them up there at the Jordan, and then go in and collect 10 stones right from the riverbed, go in and collect 10 stones, and those stones they take with them to the place that they camp at Gilgal. And if you look at your diagram real close, you got to kind of zone in here a little bit on your diagram. If you look at Gilgal, which is just outside Jericho there, you're going to see a small circle with a stack of stones, right? And that small circle is to remind us of this experience. Well, why is that important that we would pause and think about it? It really is important. It's important because it reminds us of the importance of passing on the story to the next generation. If you look at chapter 4, where they build these memorials, and you jump down to verse 6, it says, "We will use these stones to build a memorial. In the future, your children will ask you, what do these stones mean?" That Joshua, through the direction of God, has a tremendous concern for the next generation. He has a tremendous concern for God's people way into the future. And so they get these stones and they stack them up at the Jordan. They get 10 more stones and they stack them up at Gilgal where they camp, so that the children will hear the story. Parents out there, hope you're listening. This is a great invitation, a great reminder. Tell your kids the Bible stories. Tell them the stuff we're talking about today. Tell them about how the water drew back at the Red Sea. Tell them about how the water drew back when God's people entered the Jordan, right? They need to hear the stories of God's mighty acts and of the love he has for us, and especially the love he has for us in Jesus, right? Tell them the stories about Jesus. We need to win for Christ this next generation, right? And so that's a great witness to us here, right in the book of Joshua. where he says, listen, stack up the stones. Remind yourself, give the kids an opportunity to ask questions, and tell them the stories. So they stack up the stones in both places, and it becomes that reminder that they can tell that next generation what happened. Then you get into chapter 5, and God is already going ahead of them, and those stories are paying dividends of conquest, right? And so you get right away in chapter 5:1. When all the Amorite kings west of the Jordan and all the Canaanite kings who lived along the Mediterranean coast heard how the Lord had dried up the Jordan River so the people of Israel could cross, listen to this, they lost heart and were paralyzed with fear because of them. So look how far reaching, right? Look at your diagram. Look where they stack up the stones there at Gilgal. And the stories are now going all the way across to the coast, to the Mediterranean Sea. The story about God's mighty power is translating through all of that region that they're there to take hold of. And God is already going in front of them. God's already creating fear and paralyzing the enemies of God's people. And that's just a great reminder to us that God is working even when we can't see it. That God is preparing the way even when we don't totally understand it. And so there he is, preparing the way. So they get into the land, and God's preparing the way, and then a great thing happens is there's this transition for God's people in their dependence on God, right? If you go to verse 12, a significant experience takes place. It says in verse 12, no manna appeared on the day they first ate from the crops of the land, and it was never seen again. There's a great transfer, not only of leadership from Moses to Joshua, but now when God's people go into the land, they're going to depend on God to provide for them from the land. No more supernatural presence of the manna, right? No more supernatural every day, don't worry, God's got it. The food is lying on the field out there, just go get it. Now, God is going to provide for them, but he's going to provide for them through the promised land itself. And so now the manna disappears. And Joshua is established as the commander of the Lord's army. And here's where he's confronted with that commander of the Lord's army. And so it's that affirmation we talked about in chapter 1, where he's confronted by the commander of the Lord's army. And there's that affirmation. They're ready to go. They're ready to go take the land. And what's so fascinating is that before they go in, before they mount their first military battle, in chapter 5, they celebrate Passover. And this is kind of the capsule of what we've been talking about. The challenge for God's people is to be faithful in this new territory, in this new world. The challenge for God's people is to be faithful in the midst of their enemies. So in chapter 1, we get be strong and courageous, right? Just trust me, Joshua. Trust me, people of God. Be strong and courageous. We get to chapter 5, and we get this evidence that God is with them because the story is being told. His enemies are already captured in fear and they're paralyzed. And then we get the commander of the Lord's army showing up, right? You can be strong and courageous because I'm with you. And here it is. The commander of the Lord's army is ready to fight the battles for you, to go in front of you. And what do God's people do? They celebrate Passover. Instead of shining up the armor and instead of sharpening up the sword, they return to faithfulness. They start the battle. They start the conquest of the land with faithfulness. And so they return to Passover and they celebrate the experience of Passover. And they remember, before they start the battles, they remember God's faithfulness and how he delivered them from Egypt and brought them out of slavery. And now how he's brought them to this new land. You see, this is the tension that's going to continue. taking over the land, conquering the land, but doing it in a way that is just faithful, just trusting God and being faithful. Not a new story, is it? Not a new tension, right? One that you and I face every day. In the middle of our world, how do we stay faithful? How do we keep God first in the midst of all the challenges and the temptations? How do we just trust that He is going to be able to take care of us, provide for us, and deliver us? Well, it starts happening then in chapter 6. You get the wonderful experience of the fall of Jericho, and we talked about that before, where they march around 6 days, march around the 7th day, blow the horn, shout, the walls fall down. And of course, in the midst of that, great testimony of God's faithfulness, because those same spies, after the walls fall, the same spies are sent in to rescue Rahab and her whole family. And so it reminds us that God is good to His promises. And so the men, in verse 23 of chapter 6, the men who had been spies went in, and they brought out Rahab, her father, mother, brother, and all the other relatives who were with her. They moved her whole family to a safe place near the camp. And it says, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. And so Rahab is saved, and she is grafted into the people of Israel. And that's just a great testimony. There's room for one more. That God is ready to graft in people who are ready to be faithful. And that's Rahab, right? She understood. She heard the story and she understood, and she said, there is no God like yours, right? Your God is the God above the heavens and the earth, right? And so she gets grafted into the people of God. Well, then we get chapters 7 through 13 in Joshua, and there are the account really of taking over the land. Some great stories in there you should read, but they're really just the accounts of the conquest and how they take over the land. And then you get up to chapters 14 and 15, and that's how the land gets all divided up, right? And that just keeps going on. 16 the land, and 17 the land, 18 the land, right? 19 the land. Everything gets divided up by tribe, and you'll see by the time we're done today, you'll see a slide showing all the division and the division of the land. So the land gets divided up by all the tribes. One interesting thing, I think it's really cool, is shows you the heart of God again, and grace of God, is in chapter 20, you get the establishment of these cities of refuge. And it just shows you again the heart of God, because as they conquer the land, God sets up these cities of safety and refuge. And so the cities of refuge are spread out through the land, and they're there so that if by accident you kill someone, right? Something happens, an accident happens, and you're part of it, and somebody dies, you can run to the city of refuge, and there you're going to be kept safe until the time of a trial. And you can prove your innocence. What do you need to be kept safe from? Well, you need to be kept safe from that family of the guy that died who wants to take revenge on you. They blame you and they want to take revenge on you, and revenge is simple. They want to kill you. And so God sets up this grace opportunity, right, of these cities of refuge, right? So you're out, splitting logs with Sam, and the head flies off the axe, and Sam hits Sam in the head, and he dies, and it's a total accident. You didn't mean to do it; it just happened, right? And Sam's family, they're upset. They blame you for the whole thing. You can run to the city of refuge, and you can be safe from that revenge, and then you can be tried, and you can prove your innocence, and you can live in safety while you're in that city of refuge. it's just a great witness to God's grace, right? That He establishes these places of safety, right? It's also, ironically, a witness to the brokenness of our own heart, right? That we do have to have grace, that we do need to have these cities of refuge, because we don't always respond appropriately, that we get wrapped up in the things of this world and we take out revenge or hatred or anger in inappropriate ways. And so God understands our heart as much as this gives witness to His heart. And so you get these cities of refuge. Well, then the towns are divided up for the Levites, and then the eastern tribes get to go home. And in chapter 22, you get this interesting experience of the eastern tribes going home. And as they do that, they build an altar. So if you look at your diagram again, you're going to see right there in the middle above Jericho some stones and a flame. And that's kind of that reminder of this story, that the eastern tribes, right, so those tribes that were on the eastern side of the Jordan River, right, remember as the people of God came up, right, they came up by the Dead Sea, they came up there, and they decided, hey, we're going to conquer, this is nice territory, we're going to conquer this side of the Jordan as well. And a couple of the tribes said, hey, this is where we want to live, this is good land, and so we want to live here. And so they conquered the kings that were there, and they took over that land and said, yeah, this is good, we're just going to stay here. And so Moses said, well, okay, yeah, you can take this land as your inheritance, but you need to send your warriors with God's people to conquer the rest of the land. And so Moses made an agreement that they could establish their homes there, they could take over that land, the tribes could stay there, but they had to send their warriors to help the rest of the tribes conquer the land. So now that the west part of the Jordan is now conquered, the eastern tribes get to go home. And as they go home, those warriors go home, they build an altar. That doesn't make sense to us why that would be such a big deal, but it was a huge deal. They build an altar. And the western tribes hear about this, that they built an altar, and right away they assume some things, they jump to some conclusions, and they get thoroughly upset, right? They like, what are they doing? They built an altar, they built their own temple, they built their own worship, they're dividing now, they're separating from us, and this can't be, we've got to be all of God's people together, and here they are building this altar and saying they don't want anything to do with us. And so the tribes in the west get together, they send emissaries, they get all upset, they even get an army together ready to go and do battle and wipe out the tribes over on the east side. And good news is that they figure out that it's all confusion. And so they go and they sit down with these tribes in the east and they say, why are you doing this? Why are you leaving us? Why are you separating? And of course the tribes in the east respond and say, no, not at all. You got it way wrong here. We're building an altar not to separate from you. We're building an altar because we're afraid that the next generation in the future will forget that we're part of you. That when we go back to the east now on the other side of the Jordan and you establish the western side of the Jordan, we're afraid that the next generation is going to forget. That they're going to forget that we too are part of God's people. And so we're building a monument, an altar, to remind the generations in the future that we're all in it together, that we're all God's people. And that settles the dispute. Everybody likes the answer given, and everybody goes back home, and the friction and the conflict ceases. But, I find that just a really fascinating story
Because how many times in families, maybe in your family, how many times in families has the same experience happened, where somebody says something, somebody does something, somebody in the family jumps to conclusions, somebody in the family interprets it this way, right? And the net result is a lot of conflict happens, words are spoken, disputes take place, things get blown out of proportion, all because they just didn't communicate in the beginning. And this is what happens. It's just a huge misunderstanding. And that happens so often, even in our families, where things just get blown out of proportion, people get hurt, and there's a huge misunderstanding. When all we have to do is just talk with each other up front, right? Share our hearts, share our feelings, share our fears, share our anxieties, be open to one another. Scripture says we're here to bear one another's burdens, to love one another sacrificially, right? And that's what they learn in this experience, is that this all could have been avoided if they just would have shared their heart with one another to begin with. So it's just a great word for us, just a great reminder how easy it is to get conflict in our family, misunderstandings blown out of proportion, when the key is sharing our heart, right? Sharing our heart with one another. Well, that takes care of conquering the land. And the big thing is that as the book of Judges comes to a close, in chapter 23, you have Joshua issuing a word of warning. And remember that Joshua in the beginning, right back in chapter 1, when he's told, hey, be strong and courageous, right? And remember back in chapter 1, transfer of leadership, Joshua be strong and courageous. By the end of chapter number 1, the people are all signing on and they're renewing their covenant. They're saying, yes, we're going to follow you, Joshua. You're the man, right? And then you get to the end of chapter 5, and you've got the commander of the Lord's army showing up and saying, okay, God is out in front of you, and your job, Israel, your job, God's people, is just be faithful, right? Just be faithful. Well, now in chapter 23, as the book comes to a close, as Joshua's life comes to a close, Joshua gives them a word of warning. And he gives them a word of warning about the people that still live in the land. He says in verse 9 here of chapter 23, starting there, he says, for the Lord has driven out great and powerful nations for you, and no one has yet been able to defeat you. Each one of you will put to flight 1,000 of the enemy, for the Lord your God fights for you, just as he has promised. So, be very careful to love the Lord your God. Right? It's like Joshua saying, listen, remember the stories. Not only tell them to your children, but remember them for yourself. Remember that God has fought in front of you, that God has gone before you, right? So just remember faithfulness first, right? And the temptation, he outlines, is that you'll forget because you get so involved in the world. He says, but if you turn away from him, right, the Lord your God, if you turn away from him and cling to the customs of the survivors of these nations remaining among you, and if you intermarry with them, then know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive them out of your land. Instead, they will be a snare and a trap to you, a whip for your backs and thorny brambles in your eye, and you will vanish from this good land the Lord your God has given you. And so we get this tremendous challenge now laid out for God's people to be in the land and remain faithful, knowing that they didn't drive out all the people of the land. Right? So again, if you look at your diagram, remember they were supposed to come in and drive out everybody from the land. But if you look at your diagram, you see those white circles and the dotted lines. What that's trying to show you is here's really where they were successful, right? This is really the territory that they took over, and there's a lot of locals still living in the land. And Joshua is saying, listen, that's going to be dangerous. You didn't drive them all out. That's going to be dangerous. Now, you may listen to that and say, wait, what? You mean God wanted them to go in there and just wipe out everybody? Yep, he did. And that's kind of a hard word for us. It's like, wow, that seems so cruel. But think about it differently. Remember that God is a jealous God, right? He's a jealous God. Jealous for his people, right? First and foremost, God wants to protect his people. And because he wants to protect his people, he instructed them to clear out all the locals. Don't let anybody remain in the land, because he knew they would be a trap and they would be a snare. And so that's why he gave the command to wipe out everybody in the land, because he knew those people that stayed, those locals that stayed, would become a trap and a snare, that they would detract from God's people in their ability to be faithful. And that's precisely what happens, right? We know that this temptation now of being faithful in the midst of a land that has many others, many locals, and many temptations becomes the challenge. And all you have to do is go into chapter 1 of the book of Judges, and you can see how God's people failed to clear out everybody from the land. In chapter 1, it says in verse 19, the Lord was with the people of Judah, and they took possession of the hill country. But they failed to drive out the people living in the plains who had iron chariots. And all the way through chapter 1, that word failed comes up again and again and again. That while they had success, they also failed. Verse 19, verse 21, verse 27, verse 29, verse 30, verse 31, verse 33. All of those highlight how God's people failed to drive out all of their enemies. And we see in verse 35 kind of the capstone to that failure. In verse 35, it says, the Amorites were determined to stay in Mount Heres, Ajalon, and Shelabim. But when the descendants of Joseph became stronger, the Israelites, when they became stronger, they forced the Amorites to work as slaves. Wow, that's big. Think about this now. You've got God's people who were slaves in Egypt, who have now come in, conquered most of the land, but they allowed those in the land to stay. Why? For their own financial benefit. They allowed them to stay because they made them their slaves. The people that were once slaves now become the owners of slaves. Well, then you keep going, and we get our next picture here of the real challenge now for God's people is being able to stay faithful with these locals still living there. And keep in mind the challenge is they've come out of Egypt, they were slaves, they've come out of the wilderness, they were just wanderers. Now they're in the land, and they own land, and they own vineyards they didn't plant, and they got wells they didn't dig. And they have to learn to be farmers. They don't know how to do it. They have to learn to be farmers. And so they've got to figure out, how do you grow crops? How do you take care of vineyards? How do you survive in the land because there's no more manna? And so what do? They go to the locals and they say, hey, you did this before we moved in. How's this work? How do we get rain? Because we need rain for our crops. Well, the locals have the solution, and it's kind of summarized in your diagram here. You'll see the two idols up at the top, a male idol and a female idol. And so the answer the locals gave is, well, listen, the gods provide the rain, and so what you need to do is you need to go and convince the gods to provide you with rain. Now, a little word of warning here. This is kind of a PG-13 section of the teaching today, right? Because these gods provided rain because that happened when they were intimate with one another, right? And so rain came when the two gods were intimate with one another. So you, the farmer who wants rain, well, you go to the local temple, you worship those gods, and you go ahead and get intimate yourself with one of the temple prostitutes. And if you do that, the gods will watch and they'll get the idea. And so they'll get that idea and they'll get intimate with one another, and you'll get rain, because the male god is the god in the clouds and the female god is the god of the earth. And when they're intimate, fertility happens and water falls and the crops grow. So now, your job, Mr. Farmer, is to manipulate the local gods. And this becomes the problem. The people of Israel now fall into worshiping the local gods for their own self-benefit, and they begin to try to manipulate the local gods to get what they want, instead of trusting in the covenant relationship they have with the living God. They become manipulators of the local gods instead of trusting in that covenant relationship, in the character of the one true God, in the proven, right, the proven faithfulness that God has for his people. And so from now on, there is going to be this tension in the land, and the people of God continue to falter. They fall out of faithfulness, they turn to the local gods, and they walk away from their covenant relationship. And that is why we get into the period of the Judges. Because the period of the Judges is this recurring theme of a cycle of God's people falling into sin, following the local gods, God allowing a neighboring enemy to attack them or to harass them, then God's people realizing their error, crying out to God, and then God raising up a judge or a mighty warrior to defeat those who are oppressing his people. And that cycle just repeats itself over and over and over again throughout the whole book of Judges. And we're not going to take time today to go through every judge, but you can see it if you just think about some of the major judges of what happens. Right, so you have Ehud, he defeats the Moabites. You've got Deborah and Barak, who defeat the Canaanites. You've got Gideon, that defeats the Midianites and the Amalekites. You got Jephthah, that defeats the Amorites, and you got Samson, who defeats the Philistines. And hopefully, what you'll notice from that is there is no problem finding enemies of God's people. Right? There is a host of enemies of God's people. And that means there is a host of temptation for God's people to fall away from faithfulness. Now, that doesn't sound so different for us, does it? As we live in our world, right? As we live in our context, we still got enemies. God's still got enemies, right? And they're all around us, and they're always trying to tempt us to just not be strong, not be courageous, not be faithful, and instead to go the way of the world, to fall into this temptation of following the world. And yet God remains faithful. God still remains faithful, and he looks at us the same way. He looks at us with this longing and loving heart of wanting to build us and bring us to a new land and a new future, just like he did God's people. And so just real quick, I want you to see God's view by looking at the experience of one of the judges, Gideon. And it's in chapter 6 of the book of Judges. And it starts in verse 11. It says, "Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree of Ophrah, which belonged to Joash, the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Mighty hero, the Lord is with you.'" Now, hopefully you got that picture, right? Gideon's in a winepress hiding, right? He should be up on a threshing floor where the wind blows to separate the chaff. Instead, he's down in a hole. He's in a winepress trying to separate the chaff because he's hiding from the Midianites. And yet God comes along and sees him and says, "Gideon, mighty hero." How can he see him as a mighty hero? Look what comes. "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." The Lord is with you. It's the same thing as they went to take the land. God went before them. God defeated their enemies. They could be strong and they could be courageous because God was with them. And that's the same call on our life, right? We look at the map here of the tribes and we see all these tribes spread out, and the call stays the same for them, to just continue to be strong and courageous. And they have multiple times where they fail. You see the tribe of Dan in the yellow down here, and the dotted line that goes up to the top. The tribe of Dan decided they didn't like the land that they had. It wasn't good enough for them, and so they went to find new land, and they went from the south all the way up to the north because they thought that was in their best interest. And of course the trouble is, all that did was expose the south to the influence of the Philistines. And you go to Israel today and they still refer to that, right? That exposed the south to the enemies of God's people, right? And so you see the challenge that we have with this loose confederacy of tribes and the call on them now just to stay faithful, just stay faithful. As you get to the end of the book of Judges, and they are unfaithful in multiple ways, and they start asking the question, why is this? Why are we not faithful? Why do we keep having these problems? And the irony is, the tribes answer the question and they say, it's because we don't have a king. If we just had a king, like the rest of the nations out there, we could be faithful. See, they look to the answer in the world, when the answer is always resting in God, just being faithful to God. Instead, the tribes look for the answer in the world, and they say, if we had a king, if we just had a king. And so the book of Judges comes to a close in chapter 21, and the last verse of the book of Judges says, "In those days Israel had no king, and all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes." If they just had a king, was their answer, they could be faithful. And that brings us to not only a close, but it brings us to the next step of the period of the kings, and Saul and David and Solomon and onward. And so we've taken you now through the conquest. We've taken you through that cycle with the book of Judges. And yet, I hope you walk away today just hearing that theme that still applies to us today. And that is God hasn't changed. God is a faithful God, and he calls us to be strong, to be courageous, not because of ourselves, but because we know who he is, and that he goes before us, and he prepares the way. And the call on us is just be faithful. Just be faithful. There's going to be plenty of temptations. There's going to be plenty of enemies out there in the world. What we need to do is just be faithful and know that God is with us. We can be strong and courageous. We can be like Gideon the judge because God is with us. Well, I hope you take that with you for the rest of the week here. And just keep remembering God is with you. God sees you that way. God goes in front of you. He has a future for you. And we just trust Him because we know the greatest God story. And that is that God came to be with us in His Son, Jesus. And He won us the future with forgiveness and grace and an ultimate victory through Jesus. So, hey, thanks for letting me hang out with you today and to share this part of Scripture with you. And again, just keep praying, will you, for Pastor Andrew's health, that he'll be back with you next week. We'll see how it goes, see how he's feeling. But somebody's going to be here. We're going to keep doing this teaching. It's too important to give up on. So we hope this was meaningful to you. Loved hanging out with you. And yeah, I know I talk too much sometimes, but give me a little grace with you. And know that we just want you to be able to be strong, courageous, and trust God more than anything else. So we'll see you again next Tuesday. Have an awesome week and be strong and courageous. Bye, Christ Church.